I'm David Clayton, and this is the Way of Beauty podcast, conversations on Catholic faith and culture. This is episode 27, which is called Distributism, the third way or a wrong way. And I'm in conversation with Father Brad Elliott. Before I hand over to him, I just want to set the scene a little bit. Distributism is an economic and cultural ideology in which it is believed that private ownership should be widely distributed, hence the name. So it should be distributed among the population according to the principle of subsidiarity. Now, that in itself is not problematic for me, but when we dig a little deeper and get into the question of how we assess a just distribution and the means by which we achieve it, I do have reservations. Furthermore, distributists in general are ill at ease with the modern culture. Again, in this respect, I probably share the same dislike and am unhappy about many of the things that they're unhappy about. However, when I probe a little further, their critique seems to me to be flawed when they discuss what are the nature of those problems and how we might change it. And this critique is linked to their economic solutions and their economic proposals as well. The two are not unconnected. In regard to the culture, I feel that they tend to romanticize the past falsely. And I have to say, this is something coming from someone who has a pretty rosy picture of the past, as I do. Anyway, I hope you enjoy my discussions with Father Brad Elliott from the Western Province of the Dominican Order. Hello, this is episode 27 of the Way of Beauty podcast. I'm here with Father Brad Elliott, who is a Dominican of the Western Province, lives close to me here in California. And today we're going to discuss distributism. Is it a third way or is it a wrong way? And we touched on this when we spoke last time. Yeah. And this is something that, an idea at least, that appeals to a lot of Catholics and actually a lot of traditional and pious believing Catholics. I mean, I'm using those words in a positive sense, that people, genuine Catholics who have faith, and want to uphold the faith, are attracted to distributism. So it's something that's worth considering. So perhaps, Father, we could just begin, if you just describe to us what it is. Do mention as well, I mean, you talk a little bit about your history. I remember you saying last week you used to be one. So refer to that. And then, so just set the scene for us before we go into the detail of the analysis of it.
Well, first, I will say I became a Catholic about 15 or 16 years ago. When I was a student in college, I became Catholic and I was studying the Catholic faith and I, for a number of years, would have described myself as a distributist, simply because my own personal conversion was very influenced by the work of G.K. Chesterton, C.S. Lewis, G.K. Chesterton. I loved the social and historical commentary of Hilaire Belloc, who also wrote a lot about economic evils, the Catholic faith as translated into the economic sphere. So I would have described myself as a distributist, and I was very attracted to distributism. And basically, the attraction to distributism is first and foremost I can say from my own experience, distributism is fundamentally they're trying to preserve a good thing. What they're attracted to is the dignity of the human person, the dignity of the individual, and the freedom of the individual from coercive large power.
Okay,
that's the important thing that at least attracted me to distributism. This idea that the individual is to have autonomous, free choice and be the governor and the agent of his own destiny in the economic sphere. and that the great enemies of individual freedom, individual autonomy, are big government and big business.
Right.
Both of these, big government and big business, are symmetrical powers. They're symmetrical evils that are both attacking the little guy. They are both destroying the common man's ability to have freedom over his own destiny, freedom over his own family, his own community. Both of these big powers are alienating the common man from his community, or alienating the common man from his own work, from his own community, and from the ability of him to determine the destiny of his own community. That's a very powerful idea, because this is good. This is good. What the distributists are trying to preserve is something that is so good. And I was also very attracted to distributism, because distributism was very sensitive to the fact that modern technology, modern technological achievements, any one of the stages that society has gone through since the Industrial Revolution, industrial production on a massive scale brought about and made possible by technology. They're very sensitive to the fact that this alienates the person from the land, alienates individual persons from their own personal communities, their own smaller communities, and most of all, it has the power to alienate individuals from their work, because they're producing a work that is mass produced. They're producing products that are produced on a grand scale and then shipped off to places that are completely alien to the local person in his community. And that is that was attractive to me. That was attractive to me, as you can clearly imagine. Another thing that attracted me to distributism was this notion, and it was all over the place, was that somehow free market capitalism has been condemned by the Catholic Church. When I became, free market capitalism was condemned. You cannot be a Catholic and be in favor of free market capitalism. Now, as we comb the writings of the popes and the magisterium of the Catholic Church regarding Catholic social teaching, regarding economics, there rarely is a very clear understanding what capitalism even is. There's not a clear expression or definition of this capitalism that appears to be condemned. So what exactly is condemned? Is the price system condemned? Is the forces of supply and demand, are these condemned? What exactly is the church condemning? There have been times when popes like Pope Pius XI and even Pope John Paul II in Laborem Exercens does venture to put some kind of flesh on this word capitalism and say what would not be healthy for society, what we can condemn, like a greedy hoarding of resources would certainly be condemned, something like that. But because I was under the impression that free market capitalism was an intrinsic evil condemned by the church, I was driven then to distributism.
And you're saying that in fact, it hasn't been condemned by the church.
Well, certainly a free market has not been condemned by the church. Actually, a free market, a free and open economy where individuals are free to choose and engage in voluntary transactions has certainly been encouraged. This is the idea that the popes have upheld, but then this is also tacked to this Weasley word capitalism.
Yeah.
Weasley word capitalism, which everybody has a different definition of. Certainly the people who condemn capitalism have a very pejorative definition of capitalism.
Yes.
Define capitalism in the most worst way possible. And then somebody like myself who would be in favor of the value of the free market, would be in favor of a free economy, would simply define capitalism in the most extreme, most wide sense possible. But when we talk about condemning capitalism, I don't even know what these people claim is condemned by the church. Is supply and demand condemned? Is the price system condemned? What is condemned? How does the Catholic Church condemn the price system? So that was my confusion for many years. It was my confusion for many years. But when I just kind of uncritically accepted this maxim that capitalism is condemned.
This is something that I come across a great deal, is that I often find that with the mention of this word, we have two people talking past each other.
Exactly.
That the person who is happy to call themselves a capitalist is interested, certainly in the Catholic context, most of the people I know, let's put it like that, in what people such as John Paul II advocated. And he said, because he's aware of what you're describing, so maybe it might be appropriate to call this a free economy. So it's one where there's free exchange of goods and services, and freedom properly understood. So we're talking about the Catholic understanding of freedom, which has both a lack of constraint, but also the fullest freedom is with the proper understanding of the ends to which we use it.
Exactly.
And a good system of justice, which we talked about last time. And when I say that when I have conversations with people, I say I don't know anybody who calls themselves a capitalist who is not in favour of those things. Actually, I've never heard any capitalists say they're against those things. I've heard plenty condemn the sort of capitalism which he also condemned, which the derogatory term for the people who like capitalism is crony capitalism.
Yes,
which brings big business and government into partnership again, which in a way brings us back to where nicely takes us back to your flow of talk. So why did you continue then with this idea of distributism?
Well, this is the insight that I think Distributists, the insight that I really we can attribute to Distributists, and writers like Chesterton and Belloc, who kind of coined the term Distributism, is that oftentimes we hear the phrase "small is beautiful." Small is beautiful. Small economies, small business is beautiful, and this is true. They recognize, and their insight is that as institutions grow larger and larger and larger, the power that they exert over individual choice becomes more and more coercive and more corruptive of culture and individuals, and more compromising to individual freedom. And there was a great awareness on the part of both Chesterton and Belloc, and as businesses got larger and larger and larger, there was a type of cronyism or collusion that takes place between big business and big government, so that the two start working together. Government starts regulating business. And since government regulates business, business has no choice but to, in a sense, bully back and lobby big government in order to create more and more regulation that does not help small business, but always only helps the large guy.
Yeah.
Helps the large business. So there's a mutual bullying that goes on.
And the point here is that even if it is a constraint upon big business, it's usually just an irritation. It's at that level. But the same constraint can stop small businesses even getting into the market or starting, and can put small businesses out of business because of the cost of implementing it.
Exactly. The marginal cost of most government regulation on business is easily absorbed by the large guy, is easily absorbed by large business. It's precisely small business that must have the freedom and wiggle room to not have government on their back, to not have regulation. Excessive government regulation on business virtually always drowns out the small business. This collusion that goes back and forth between big business and big government was exactly what guys like Chesterton and Belloc were sensitive to. Chesterton called these two powers Hudge and Gudge, big government and big business. And then he was right in saying that for the small clerk that works for the big corporation, or the small clerk that works for the government bureaucrat, is in the same situation. They equally have no freedom over their life. They are equally at the mercy of powers that are beyond their control. And to a certain extent, this is true. This is true, but the distributist makes an error, because the distributist does see the power of government and the power of business as symmetrical powers.
Yes.
Where they're the same type of power, and that's a mistake. That's a mistake. Government has the type of power that it does, the power to enforce, to enact law, the power to enforce law, the power to punish those institutions or parties that violate law. The government has this type of power precisely because it is in charge of the common good, and it's in charge of establishing and creating and protecting those conditions within which authentic human freedom can actually take place.
Right.
That, freedom can take place. Business, big business, no matter how large business gets, never has this type of coercive power. Let's say Amazon, Walmart. And Walmart, no matter how large Walmart gets, no matter how it might seem to us that we have no choice but to shop at Walmart for the cheap goods that they provide, Walmart can never have a standing army. Walmart does not have tanks in the back of the shop that are prepared to enforce their laws. It doesn't work that way. Walmart, as a business, cannot impose laws or rules on society that free citizens have to abide by. There's a different type of power. So no matter how large business gets, it never has the coercive power of government.
So the response to that might be, because Walmart is the great flagship of the sort of what is bad, should we say, in the eyes of distributists. It always comes up. My sort of joking definition of a distributist, and this is my negative prejudice coming out, is that a distributist is someone who hates Walmart and keeps chickens in their backyard and thinks that everyone else should do the same. And I can't, I say that because I can't think of what else they're in favour of. But one thing that just when I talk to distributors, they know they hate Walmart usually, even to the point of recommending that people, it's a moral choice that is bad, a bad moral choice to go and actually buy things there. I've heard people say that.
That's right. Chesterton would say the same.
Okay, so the response to that is, well, they may not have quite the same sort of power, and perhaps we'll acknowledge that point of crony capitalism. If they've got the government on that side, okay, maybe I'll concede that point. I hadn't thought of that. We'll acknowledge that. But the sheer economy of scale that is allowed by Walmart effectively keeps others out of the market and bullies, in a different sort of way, those small players out of business. Do you have a thought about that at all?
Mm-hmm. Well, to a certain extent, we can say that this is, to a certain extent, this is true. To a certain extent, as let's say any business A, whether it's Walmart or Amazon or whoever the token bad guy is, as these businesses get larger, there will be smaller companies that are driven out of the market, or that simply can't compete. In a truly free market, what generally happens is that the small players are not simply driven out of the market. What happens generally is that the small players simply are able and have the freedom to find substitutes, have the freedom to create substitutes, or they also have the freedom to innovate new substitutes that can take the place of products that consumers feel that they need, or for which they feel compelled to go to the big guy. In a truly free market, there's also, and the most important part of free exchange is that it allows for innovation to create valuable and effective and cheap substitutes.
Yes, and this, of course, doesn't deny the fact that in that there is a transitionary period in that you have the effect of Walmart moving in, and perhaps some businesses struggling, some going out of business as a result of that. And that is a personal tragedy for everybody who suffers. What it doesn't take into account is on the other side, and this is what you might call dynamism of the market is one thing which is unsettling for some people. What it doesn't take into account is the positive impact of many people, the consumers, having cheaper goods, because we don't know where ultimately the money that they save, where they direct that. Is it going into just buying more and people getting fatter, so to speak, or is it being some of it will be spent on investment, more jobs of a different nature? And the overall effect, I don't think it's clear that the overall effect is negative. The other thing is that there is this belief that the sort of jobs that Walmart offers are low quality, almost necessarily exploitative. I make one point before I'll sort of throw that back at you, but it always occurs to me, I don't know what people in a small hardware shop are paid. The business owner will be doing quite nicely, one assumes, if it's a viable business. But I imagine those that are working there are probably paid something similar to what a Walmart worker is. They're not going to be highly paid, certainly. They're likely to be young people, high school people doing a job in their time off, this sort of thing. So it's not clear to me that it automatically means that you have low-paid jobs replacing high-paid jobs, actually. But what about this point of the exploitation of low-paid workers that Walmart is introducing when it moves into an area?
Well, exploitation that's kind of the buzzword. That is for exploiting workers. Distributists would call them wage slavery. So where it is reduced, but his labor hours at a wage, which places the person at the mercy of an employer. With regards to what depends on the situation. You're right. It's not necessarily true that the good jobs are being driven out, and then the small jobs or the small low paying jobs are taking their place. It's not necessarily the case. It's not necessarily the case. So I don't know in any particular case, like with Walmart, I don't know how much a Walmart employee is getting paid in comparison to, let's say, a hardware shop. So yeah, I don't know in any particular case. What I would say in general is that employees are also far better off when they have the ability to freely sell their labor to agents in the market. Certainly, if a place like Walmart or Amazon had a monopoly on selling, on providing labor, this would create an evil. But rarely in a truly free market does that happen. Rarely in a situation where laborers have no other option but to sell their labor to the big guy.
And some would say, well, they have very little choice. My response to that would be, well, how do you deal with that? Is it to stop Walmart coming in, or is it to aim for a freer situation?
Right.
And in other words, encourage the introduction of other jobs. And that would force then Walmart to pay more. The other thing is this idea of a monopoly, that I'm not convinced that it's necessarily always bad, provided there is free entry to the market. If somebody is keeping competitors out because nobody is able to offer the service or the good more cheaply or
Mhm.
of better quality, even in a niche way,
Yeah.
but that is the only barrier to the market, then I would say that's a legitimate monopoly.
Yeah.
That still potentially people could enter. But if
Yes.
somebody is good at doing what they're doing and they put other people out of business because they offer better services to the consumer,
Mhm.
that is legitimate, I would say.
I would say, well, that's complete, and that shouldn't be prevented by force.
Yes, I agree.
You know, helping consumers, giving people, giving in your community back to goods and services should never be snuffed out by coercive force, whether by government regulation. What must never be snuffed out by government regulation is the ability for players to enter freely into the market, for the ability for competitors to enter. And what happens with the big company when government steps in and starts to regulate is they generally regulate the small guys out of the market.
Yeah.
And if small guys are regulated out of the market, there will not be a free market of labor. And if the small guys are regulated out of the market, the little guy, the man or woman on the street has no choice but to sell his labor to the big guy.
Right, and this brings us to the point here that while the situation may not be perfect, we pointed out certain difficulties. You know, this classic case of Walmart moving in. There is at least in the short term, even in the perfect situation, a detrimental effect on some people, quite likely.
Yeah.
But the question is, what is better than this? What do you do about it? How do you deal with the situation? As we've heard, regulating it, stopping people doing it is worse, creates a worse situation. The answer, it seems to me, is freedom.
Yes, this is ultimately, David, why I, in my own personal life, my own personal journey through understanding these concepts, trying to, I eventually pulled away from distributism and just says, no, I'm in favor of a free market economy. You call that capitalism? That's fine. Whatever label you want to give it. It's simply because I realized that the distributists, although they're very sensitive to certain evils in the economy, they have no solution as to how to solve these evils that does not somehow incorporate a parallel evil or an even greater evil of the coercive force of government stepping in and simply regulate death, regulate to an inch of its life, so that we can supposedly protect the pristine local smaller communities that we see big business as destroying. And the distributists, even along with socialists and communists, have the same attitude towards this coercive power of government, that we're going to bring government in to regulate big business. And we're going to bring government in to regulate business so that once we get the right regulations, not all these bad regulations that we've had in the past, just the right ones. Once we get the right regulations in, then everything will be fine. Well, no, this is a complete deception. It's a deception. Even the right regulations, whatever that might mean, have unintended consequences that economists for now a century and a half have been drawing out for us. Does that make sense?
Well, yes, and this leads me to something that I've seen in some distributists that I've engaged with, is a tendency for all the fact that they are interested in freedom to an authoritarian approach.
Exactly.
And some end up doing this by actually distorting the meaning of freedom. So, but in a different way to many other modern people do, many secular people do. So in my mind, there are two components of freedom. One, as I said, is the lack of constraint. And the other is a full knowledge of what is good. So in other words, we can't exercise that freedom well unless we understand what our end is, or tell us what our purpose is, and we have the capacity to do what is the practicable best. But the people in the secular world, very often, the sort of generalized picture is of people who focus only on lack of constraint, which is license.
Yeah.
But the alternative is not to eliminate lack of constraint and make people do what we think is right.
Right.
And even if it's the teaching of the church, God gives people free will, so we should respect that. And now, the grey area, of course, is where one person interferes with the freedom of somebody else, and then that's where the judicial system comes in. And that's always going to be a slight tension there, because
this is one of the insights of classical liberalism, and I believe it emerges from the Christian tradition. One of the insights is that under law, human beings must be treated equally under law. Under law, but this precisely gives human beings the freedom, the sphere of freedom in society within which they can live out their own striving for their own perfection, their own telos.
Right, and the response that might be given by the Catholic who wishes to make people do what is right is Aristotle. They would say, well, if you force people to do what is right, eventually they come to love it, and so it's justified. But the response to that, and I let you give that, it comes from St. Thomas, doesn't it? That the law is made for most people.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Law. Law is made for most people. This is a huge, huge topic.
Yeah.
The nature of law and coercive power, and law is established to create virtue. Law is established to engender virtue in people and to direct behavior. But one of the features of law that St. Thomas, Augustine, they all recognize is that not all evils can be prescribed by law.
Yes.
Not all evils in society can be snuffed out by human positive law. If we try to render illegal all human evils in society through positive law, what this is going to do is actually create a situation where there's more evil. It's going to create a situation where the conditions for people to live out their freedom and to live out their goodness are constrained, and you're going to snuff out more good.
And a classic example of that would be the temperance movement. I always think where it ended up creating disrespect for the police, for the law, for it's not even clear that it's morally right anyway. But we could see the point there that it had a detrimental effect. It was disastrous.
It's a very detrimental effect, precisely because when we try to prescribe through law all evil, even evils that could never be enforced, laws that could never be enforced, then what we do is we actually weaken the power of all law in society. We weaken the power of positive law. Law becomes a mere suggestion for citizens, rather than being what it truly is, which is law.
Yeah. All right. So we can come back to this. What I'd like to do is think about also the sort of cultural sensibilities. Because I feel this is driving Distributists a great deal as well. Just as something that I'm aware of, because I'm interested in culture and the beauty of our surroundings. And I share, I think, with what I hear a lot of Distributists saying, this mistrust of whatever is producing the modern culture is producing a lot of ugliness. So can you relate any of that to your personal experience, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people would say, industrial mass production is ugly. Industrial mass production is ugly, made possible by all this technology we have. There's an ugliness to it. There's an aesthetic that's not pleasing. And because the aesthetic is not pleasing, this must be an evil. You know what I mean? It must be an evil because this is, and I would say this is just simply a great lack of imagination for the first part. On the just simply a lack of imagination. We say, industrial production is ugly, but at the same time, the quality of life, the quality of life that it makes possible for so many thousands and millions of people in the world, that's also a beautiful thing. That's also beautiful. Yes, there's a certain ugliness to mass production, but the fact that men, women, and children all over the world are able to have access to greater water, greater health care, more food through mass production, mass farming, this is also a beautiful thing.
Yes. My response to this actually is to say that I agree that when we. By the way, if you could stop clicking your pen, we can hear that on the.
Oh, can you? Okay, sorry.
That's right. So it is that while certainly we look at industry, everybody is aware that the industrial estate is an ugly place.
Mm-hmm.
But what I would say is it actually doesn't need to be. It's not intrinsic to industry. No. But and what is happening is that the forces that restrict freedom are holding sway here. And where you see ugliness in even what is predominantly, in many ways, a beautiful thing, certainly the idea and what is emerging from it, the fault ultimately lies with the source and the greatest force for the generation of a beautiful culture, and that's us. It's the liturgy, it's the church, this is why there's liturgical reform that has been going alongside the rise of the industrialization, shall we say, since the early 19th century. We're still in that process. Some of it has been done very badly, as we know, and so that is not helping. I freely can see that. But nevertheless, what we need to strive for is a Catholic culture which can inform and modify and add to all those beautiful and good things that you're describing. And it's not until we do that, and this begins with liturgical renewal and then artistic and architectural and musical renewal, shall we say, in harmony with what is right liturgical practice. Then you have the driving force for something which touches every aspect of human life. And I always think, I have my sort of stock arguments against mass production, for example. If you go back to the 18th century, in which still there were some elements more elements of a Christian culture sort of intrinsic to what was going on, the factories that were made in those days, I'm not saying they were pleasant places to work in by modern standards, but they are World Heritage Sites because of their beauty. The things they produced, such as Wedgwood pottery, are sought after antiques, and they were produced in factories in what at the time was called the Black Country in Britain, because there was so much soot around. And so it doesn't need to be the case that automatically mass production and industrialization engenders a sort of sameness and sterile product. It comes down to the design. And for all that, I still say that I'd rather have mass production, even as it is now, than relying on craftsmen, because they simply couldn't supply sufficient of most of the things that we need to give people a good life. So I'm not interested in going back. I don't have this nostalgia for a situation which really cannot help us now. I think the answer is to add to what we have, which is good in many ways, and make it better. And I think that many distributists have this misplaced nostalgia.
There's a misplaced nostalgia. There's a fear. There's a fear that the modern world has gotten so ugly that by necessity we must go backwards. We must go back to a time when it was right. Now, first of all, it's a failure of imagination. There was never a time when everything was right. There was never a panacea in the past that now we can simply go back to. That's always a deception. It's just very, very naive thinking. But also, you're right, there's nothing intrinsically ugly about mass production. There's nothing intrinsically ugly about using technology or utilizing technology to make greater use of natural resources. In fact, there is a beauty to that. There's a beauty to using technology.
Yes, I agree.
To expand the use of resources, to make the raw materials of the world more beneficial to more individuals. There's a beauty to that too. And oftentimes the Distributists or the Distributists or those of the ilk have this reaction to technology, that technology alienates us from the earth, from the world.
Yes.
And this is generally, let me give you an example of generally what they mean. 5,000 years ago, if man wanted a pot of hot water, he would have to create a clay pot out of the soil, walk down to the river, get water with his clay pot, bring the clay pot back, heat the clay pot up on a fire, and have his water. Every stage of that process is completely transparent to that man. There's no mystery there. He is completely responsible for every stage of that process, and there's no information in that process that doesn't come directly from that man's head, right?
Mm.
Now, in the modern industrialized, technology-driven world, if I want a pot of hot water, what do? I turn on the sink, I turn on the faucet, the hot water faucet, and I fill up a pot that I purchased at the store with hot water, right?
Yeah.
Now, the simple act of turning on a faucet and getting hot water automatically employs the expertise and the information of thousands and thousands and thousands of people in the economy. There had to be somebody to manufacture the faucet. There has to be a hot water generator somewhere, somebody to manufacture the hot water generator, somebody to create the pipes that brought the piping into my home, somebody to create the pot that I use. So every part of this process is now not transparent to me. I'm able to use the expertise and the information of thousands of agents in the economy to simply get that one pot of hot water. The simple action of turning on the faucet and getting hot water is now something that's far more accessible to me, but at the same time, I am able to use the labor and the information of thousands of other people. So in one sense, we can say that technology has separated me from the land. Right? In one sense, it's separated me from the land. But in another sense, the modern technological world has connected me to a network of players, a network of people with expertise that I don't have. But even though I don't have that expertise, I don't have the information. I don't have all the information at my disposal that's used to turn on the hot water faucet. I'm able to use that information because I'm connected to a market. I'm connected to a whole network of people that are all able to make my life possible. So in a certain sense, yes, technology alienates us from the world, alienates us from the land, but in another sense, technology unites us to other people. And there's also a beauty there.
Which brings us nicely to this idea of chickens in the backyard. Yeah. This feeling that we are separated from the land. And I think, again, there's something to this. And I think it's stronger in the US, actually, because of the way that the laws of ownership are, but from where, as compared with where I am in the UK, and I'll explain that in a moment. But this feeling that we have to be growing things in order that this comes from Leo the 13th, I think. It's natural to man to work the land. Now, I've got a few comments. So, do you have anything to say about that? Do you keep chickens, for example?
Well, no, I as a religious, I don't own chickens. I live in many ways. I get my food like your average person does in our culture. As we just make use of the grocery store. Yeah. It is certainly natural for man to work the land because the land, or saying the earth, is precisely that set of raw materials that God has given to the human person to use to satisfy our needs. And the church has always insisted there's a type of universal destination of all goods. All the goods of the earth are destined for a universal destination. And when we say it's man's duty to work the land, or man by nature works the land, we simply can't be stuck in contracting this down to farming. This is a contraction. We can't say that working the land or taking the natural resources of the world and rendering them more useful to society necessitates that we farm. No, this is a failure of the imagination to see that man cultivating the garden, or man realizing his primordial vocation to work the garden of the world and render the natural gifts of the world useful to his fellow man, is restricted to something like agriculture. Technology is one of the ways that we primarily do this. The use of technology, the creation of greater and greater technologies that in greater ways, this has rendered the modern world possible.
Yes, I agree with you. It is a contraction. And actually, it's not what Leo XIII said. He said explicitly it's not limited to simply production of goods for food or something like that. I can't remember the exact phrasing. So where I go is, it's beautiful what you said, that technology comes under that umbrella. But what I say is that it's part of the American response, particularly. It's not what I see in Europe, for example. That it always is about productive use of the land. When people, the very phrase, if you say I'm planting a garden, in America, the assumption is that you're planting vegetables, the things to eat. In Britain, they think flowers. And they think something for the beauty of it. And that is the great tradition in Britain, is flower gardens. And it's not a feminine thing. I've spoken about this in other podcasts, that Adam was a gardener. Christ was, as the new Adam, was mistaken as the gardener. This is a masculine calling as much as a feminine, or as much for men as it is for women. And so anybody, if they feel this desire to propagate the land, can grow flowers. Anybody can do this. And actually, given the availability of goods and the cheapness of them by other means, which I have no qualms about going down to the supermarket buying chickens, especially if they're already cooked. Fantastic, saves me the effort. And eggs as well. Then what is a better thing for me to do? I think to grow a garden for the beauty of it and for the contemplation of it. This is the Mary as opposed to the Martha. Both are necessary, but the contemplative aspect of the garden is very often neglected, I think, over here particularly.
That's it.
And the other thing is that in Britain, coming out of, and this is something that in many ways I have more in common with the sort of hippie culture, which comes from around here. And it's amazing how many similarities there are with hippie culture and many good approaches to the environment and to community. What they lack is the leaven of God, basically, to bind it and give it its true end. But I'm a great hiker. I love walking. We go on hikes together, and it wouldn't be possible for me to buy sufficient land to have a 10-mile walk anywhere, and never mind the sort of variety that I do. So how can I go hiking? Well, the answer is that other people who own land allow me to walk, on the understanding that I respect the land. And so in America, that tends to be usually the government. And they put areas aside for walking. In Britain, the tradition is that landowners allow people, they call it public rights of way. Eventually it was brought into law because it wasn't being respected by the landowners. They were trying to stop it. But nevertheless, for centuries, and it goes back to medieval times when people had to have access to that strip of land, that they had to walk across somebody else's land to get to their own. And so they were given this right of way. And that then changed into something that whereby people walked across other people's land, and provided they respected it and stuck to the footpath, they were allowed to do so. So those novels, the Jane Austen novels, where they walk to the neighbouring house, they're going across farmers' lands and other people's lands. And it was just taken for granted that they could do so. Now, this, to me, is a classic example of the proper understanding of the not just the rights of private property, but the privileges, and how we understand that if we have a privilege of ownership of land, there are ways in which we can accord certain freedoms to people who don't own it. But it needs this understanding from both parties that I'm not going to go onto that land, steal the crops, and shoot everything that I see in sight, for example. I'm going to respect what's there. So it needs this hierarchical understanding of society that is in harmony with, if you like, with the church as the sort of model of hierarchy, if you like.
Yeah, the right to private property is still under a rule of law. It's under a rule of law, and that rule of law actually renders the property more useful to more agents in society.
Yes.
It renders the private property, even though it's private, and actually because it's private, actually becomes useful to more people. Yes. Whereas, and this actually is a segue, the Distributists. The Distributists have a really very good insight, and right here is the key to Distributism is understanding the dignity of private property.
Yes.
Private property is key to Distributism because they realize that the ability of the human person to obtain, to use, and dispose of his own private property is the key to his freedom. Now, this has also been this has been a leitmotif of the popes throughout the encyclicals of the Catholic Church about private property. Private property is fundamental to Catholic social teaching. And why is that? It's because private property allows individuals to make better use of their goods, to make better use of the land, right? Like what you're saying, it's precisely the private property and the private property rights, guided under law, are allowing individuals to make to render the goods in their ownership useful to other people around them.
Yes, and so, for example, I have no desire whatsoever to be a farmer. I love farmland, and I can go out into it and I can see cows, I can see sheep. One of the things that I used to do in Britain is because there is land around here in this part of the world, in the East Bay, that where you have that sort of access, and that has been done by private ownership of trusts and some companies who then lease the land, I think this is the model, to farmers on the condition that they respect these footpaths. And so it is used for agriculture, it's used well, and so you can get out. And I think there is a great beauty to the landscape when man is using it for what it ought to be. And some landscape ought to be pasture land or farmland or for crops. And when that is done in that way, that is beautiful. That is what the European countryside looks like. That's why it looks like that. There is no wilderness there. And I feel a frustration if I can't get out into the land. I don't want to farm, but I love to go and see it being done. I can grow plants and flowers, however small a space I have. I can at least have a plant pot. And so that desire to have a connection with and see the processes going on, which I think is intrinsic to man, and Leo XIII points this out, is part of every individual's natural desire, not just for mankind as a whole. We want a sense of a participation in this. That it's actually the private ownership and a proper understanding of that which gives people the opportunity to do that, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And private ownership is key. And this is also another attraction that Catholics have to distributism. Distributists recognize the importance of private ownership. Now, what a distributist, where they would make the error is, and this is where distributism actually gets its name, David. Distributism gets its name from the insistence that private ownership be widely distributed.
Yes.
The wide distribution of private property. In a free society, David, in a truly free society, people will be property owners, but everybody doesn't have to be a property owner. Everybody doesn't have to be a property owner. I, for example, I have a vow of poverty. I have freely given up my right to own property. It's something that I've chosen. I have a right to do that. Other people choose of their volition to not be property owners. They choose to, actually, they feel that it's a better use of their skills to work for property owners.
Yes.
You know, to be a doctor. Let's say a carpenter. Carpenter wants to work for a property owner. There's nothing wrong with this. In a free society, in a free and prosperous society, this option will be open to individuals. And there's nothing wrong there. There's no degradation of the dignity, let's say, of a worker simply because he's working on someone else's property. There's no intrinsic alienation there to the worker because he's working with someone else's property or working through someone else's capital.
That's a Marxist view, isn't it? That there is.
It's a deeply Marxist. Yes, it is. It's the notion of Marxist alienation, and this actually can be a subject maybe of even further podcasts that we do in the future. Is that distributists and Marxists have the same enemy, and nothing unites people more than having a common enemy. So even though true distributism in the Chestertonian, Bellacian sense and communism are completely opposite. Mm-hmm. In the modern world, I've even seen this on a lot of blogs, distributists end up adopting a lot of the rhetoric of Marxists, sometimes even adopting the very logic of Marxism, because, and I think the interconnection is that they have the same attitude towards coercive power. You know, the same kind of bully attitude towards we're going to use the power of the state to force people to do what is right. Yeah. And this is why there is a connection that I have seen between modern, very contemporary Catholics who call themselves distributists and Marxist ways of thinking.
Right. Is there anything else we need to cover? I think, is there anything?
Well, I don't know. We've talked about certainly we've talked about a lot. Like I say, I, in my own thinking, owe a lot to the Distributists for helping me a lot in my early days, in my early Catholic days of understanding Catholic social teaching. Although I really appreciate Distributists, and I appreciate their sensitivity to certain evils in society. I think they are blind to the fact that oftentimes they're the paternalistic way in which they want to enforce this kind of pristine aesthetic version of society is an evil.
That reminds me, actually, the final point. There was someone who used to come and teach when I was at Thomas More College called Harry Verizon, who was an economist from a University of Detroit, I think, the Catholic University, the Jesuit University. He ran the master's program there. He was an Austrian economist. Okay. And he wrote a book, a textbook called "It Doesn't Have to Be This Way." He always used to say, I am a distributist. I believe in distribution of goods, but he felt that the best way to do that and to do it most equitably actually is through the free market, and where you have just the system we're describing. And it's so a large business or somebody having a greater concentration of ownership is not in itself bad. Then it might be natural for some people to do that because actually they're able to use those resources better. And even if it is, who's to decide what the right distribution is? That's the problem. And we always come back to this situation that when you have anything that imposes something and restricts freedom, the chances are it's going to be worse than something that just protects freedom and allows the whatever comes up to emerge naturally. And so I would urge distributors, I hope you don't feel we've been too negative and rude to you, have a think about the goals you're looking for, and how the free economy, let's avoid that word capitalism if you wish to, the free economy as described by people such as certainly John Paul II in Centesimus Annus, and is distinguished from those other forms of capitalism where you have a restriction of freedom, to think about how they might actually achieve the ends that you're looking for. Certainly I think they do. I think I share the goals that you have.
David, this was ultimately my own personal journey when I realized that the very goods that distributists are trying to preserve and promote are actually promoted best by a free market economy.
Yeah.
Are the freedoms of the individual, the greater autonomy, a greater incentive to virtue. Greater incentive to virtue is actually promoted far more by a free market economy. And this is almost undeniable when you look at the history of the 20th century.
Well, I would agree. I'll be interested to hear if any people have any comments. I look forward to reading those. I think we finished there, unless there's anything you need to add. It sounds like we reached a nice conclusion.
Thank you.
We're going to continue. It's a pleasure. It's great to have you, Father. Thank you so much. We're going to continue these discussions, and that we've got about 4 or 5 planned on issues such as this, on issues private property, and self-interest, even an analysis of Marxism, why it's so alluring, and especially in the forms that it exists today. And I can't wait to cover those subjects too. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
You've been listening to the Way of Beauty podcast, conversations on Catholic faith and culture. If you enjoyed this episode, then please give us a 5-star review on iTunes. This will help others to find it too. Also, if you're interested in delving more deeply into the material that we discuss, you can do a course at the Pontifex University website. That's pontifex.university.